When we think back to the 90s and the emergence of Web 1.0, I remember trying to explain to my parents what the World Wide Web is or was, right? And it was hard. They didn't really appreciate it until they began to use the applications on it. And then Web 2.0 didn't follow that same path, right? What we see in Web 2.0 is the emergence of these tech giants, these primarily social media platforms. You've got YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and they didn't adopt the same kind of standards that made interoperability possible across social media. And Web 3.0 is an attempt to try and change that.
I still think it's hard for most people, and it's been hard for me, to visualize that future of everything being tokenized and how it changes everything, because we've never seen it before. And it sounds correct in theory. I guess in the ideal world going forward is your parents and my parents will use it and maybe not even know they're using it.
What we're building is just infrastructure. It's plumbing, right? It's not meant to be seen. In fact, it's successful if you never think about it. If you have to think about it, then there's still problems. When you put all of these pieces together, it fundamentally changes the way finance works within our society. And then it goes beyond that. It's broader than just finance. So this new Web 3.0 that we are just touching on as a major component of itself, that being tokens, tokenization, and then NFTs is just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to have profound impacts, and we're in for quite the ride over the next 10 years.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Mance Harmon, the computer scientist, entrepreneur, and technology executive. You are the co-founder and CEO of Hedera hashgraph, a platform that offers a distributed public ledger that enables anyone to easily develop secure, fair, fast, decentralized applications. You have taught computer science in the United States Air Force Academy and have over 20 years of leadership experience in a wide range of corporations, government agencies, and high-tech startups, specializing in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and distributed consensus algorithms. At Hedera, you believe that distributed ledger technology can play a key role in ensuring an inclusive financial future for all. Your aim is to lead the way in building a trusted and decentralized world that is accessible and affordable to the masses, and you think we are entering a time where everything in the world will be tokenized. Mance, welcome to London Real.
Hi, Brian. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Mance, it's great to have you here. So much to talk about with the technology and your background, but I got to start with the war games. I think you were involved in some war games with the military in the back in the day. And for people that don't know, there was a massive movie that, quite frankly, I don't know if the kids have watched these days, but it was called War Games, starred Matthew Broderick, and it was an amazing film back when, films could take over the world for a little while, like Jaws and War Games. And it was this scenario, as I remember, where basically the US and Russia went to nuclear war because of the computer program that had simulated that nuclear war. And maybe it was our first look into AI, maybe, damaging our future, but it was a highly captivating movie. They were stuck in this bunker in a mountain in Colorado, which maybe you have been in. And so I got to start off and ask, how much can you tell us about how you were involved in these computerized simulations of nuclear warfare? And was the movie accurate?
Well, look, first off, the bunker is real. It's part of NORAD. That's what they were talking about. Yes, I've been able to be part of NORAD, been in that bunker, in that mountain that they were talking about. Was the movie accurate? No, not at all. But having said that, it is true that the military builds simulators for missile defense. I was leading one of those programs, one of the major programs that made it possible for the United States to work with its allies and play war games to try and determine how to protect its population centers from incoming ballistic missile defense or ballistic missiles, right? It was ballistic missile defense that we were learning how to pursue as the military. And so it was a lot of fun. Very interesting. And yeah, I normally tell the story about war games, and it's the first time that I've been interviewed that you've led with that somebody else has actually told the story. And it's you hit the nail on the head. It was very much like that in some ways, but in other ways, not at all.
Do you find that when you say the movie War Games, most people these days know it, or is that something, because it was
a lot of people do. A lot of people do. In fact, what I normally do is say, okay, you've seen the movie War Games. Do you remember the password? Right. And if people watch the movie, they might remember Joshua. That's right. That's right. That's the password. And yeah, exactly.
Wow. You bring back memories. It was a really well-made movie with some great characters and an amazing set. I was about to ask you if they actually were able to film at NORAD for the movie.
No, NORAD looks nothing like the set. The set very much Hollywood, not real life.
The set looks better than NORAD, I'm guessing.
The set looks bigger. You don't take that size of a set, if you remember the giant screens and massive room, and put it inside of a mountain, right? That doesn't work.
It actually sounds fictionalized that this place even exists, but I know it does. But it's a reminder. And I remember I grew up, in these times in the 80s where, that was one of the main things on Americans' mind was this potential nuclear war. And there were movies on television the day after. I don't know if you remember that movie that was like and that terrified me as a kid. I had bad dreams.
Freaked me out.
Right. And it was really on American consciousness. It probably drove defense spending. Probably some of it was justified. Some of it we'll never know. Obviously, the Cold War ended, without firing a shot, but it's important, the work that you did there. And it's probably really important that we had all these facilities there, even if, the American public didn't know about them.
Well, it is important work. And, it's been 20 years since I was involved in that. But even now, I can see that the work continued, and we see these weapon systems that are capable of shooting down missiles out of the sky, on their way in. And, the world depends on those now for its defense. And I'm sure it's progressed far beyond what I understood back 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, most definitely. There's some great books about, the Secretary of Defense during the Reagan administration and how he was just, leading this whole effort through military technology and oil prices to really just bring down this threat. And it's fascinating if anybody ever wants to go back there. I actually worked for a company called the Aerospace Corporation in 91, 92 as an intern when I was at MIT. And there were a lot of projects going on with like the Brilliant Eyes program and a lot of this stuff where they were trying to potentially shoot down warheads from outer space. So I got a little look into what that was like. And then, of course, I got seduced by Wall Street and went that way. But I kind of can a little bit know what that feels like to be in there. You took all of that knowledge in the Air Force, computer science and everything, and then you started applying it into technology. And am I right in assuming that it's maybe the cybersecurity aspect of it that you took most from the military, or was it a lot of things that you brought into private sector?
Well, so I had a very non-traditional career path in the military. I did research in a small team of 5 people working for the senior executive in the Air Force for machine learning. So it started off very early in deep technology, machine learning and AI specifically. And then that led on to teaching at the Air Force Academy. I mean, most officers don't work in a lab and they don't go teach, so, and then from there, I went to the Missile Defense Agency, also a very unusual role in the military, managed this massive software program for the Missile Defense Agency. So I had a lot of deep tech and managerial experience, all of which certainly helped in my transition. And then, you know, in the military, there's a certain work ethic that you learn just because you have to. It's just ingrained in you from the time you go into boot camp, and then you live it every day. And there are these sort of non-tangible benefits that you pick up from being in the military. All of that contributed to, you know, my career path later and success today, for sure.
Interesting. And you're probably talking about just personal discipline and expectations and work ethic. And I guess you got a crash course in management when you go into the military and go into being an officer.
As a young officer, I don't remember my age. I was probably in my late 20s when I was managing this program for the Missile Defense Agency. It's just unheard of to have that kind of responsibility for people in the private sector at that age. It just normally doesn't happen. And in the military, you have the opportunity to do that. And sometimes it's thrust upon you. And in my case, I welcomed it and learned a lot from it. It was a great experience.
Yeah, I just had a flashback to Colin Powell's biography. And he was saying that only in the military, you know, could he have had such a structured, you know, career growth path, you know, based on his merit. And he was just noting that, you know, whatever you might say about the military, he's like, there's no way I could have achieved this in the private sector. And for that time in America, it was interesting. I don't have any military experience, but obviously I've read a lot about people in there. But that's a really fascinating observation. And one thing, I guess, in the military, I mean, obviously these days in the last 20 years, cybersecurity is the buzzword. There's a lot of investment in it. But I guess in the military, there's always a security component, right? It's something you're always thinking about. So maybe you grew up in an environment where that's something that's always on your mind, and maybe that's carried over now to what you do now.
No, it is. It's exactly right. In fact, I remember very early being educated about EFIs. We called them EFIs, essential elements of friendly information. So you have to be careful about, in the military, you have to be careful about sharing information that might not otherwise look like it's sensitive at all, but in the aggregate becomes really damaging or consequential. And especially today in the world of data mining, right? This is precisely the same principles now being applied on a mass scale, because we live in a totally different world today. The data is there. You don't have to depend on talking to people or having personal interactions. You can pull out these EFIs, these essential elements of friendly information, from Facebook profiles or YouTube videos, or, you know, just social in general. And the lessons that we learned back then, we didn't even call it cybersecurity. We used to call it information warfare before it was called cybersecurity. And the importance of that discipline has, of course, only grown tremendously in the past 20, 25 years.
Yeah, I'm having flashbacks to the Aerospace Corporation, which, by the way, is a consultancy for the Air Force. It sounds like it has a name like a private sector company, but it really wasn't. For me, it was a great learning experience for a summer intern from MIT. I'd actually worked at Ford Motor Company my first summer, which was a dream. I had a Ford Mustang as a kid I used to work on. But I also, when I was in Dearborn, Michigan, I thought, I don't know if I want to do this the rest of my life. So I bumped to the Aerospace Corporation. And I remember, Mance, all the posters on the wall saying, you never know who's listening. Yeah. Or, you know, and then there was security clearances and top security clearances and safes and people locking doors. And they were kind of basically signaling to the workforce, kind of what you just said, is that, you know, don't say anything. Be careful who's listening, because, like you said, before data mining, there were people that were listening, right? That could piece together things and make conclusions.
That's right. That's right. Those were the old days.
Yeah, the old days. I know. I'm appreciative that I went down that path, but I'm also kind of, you know, glad I didn't in that sense and did some other things. Tell me about this evolution into Hedera Hashgraph. I know you have an incredible co-founder, but does it ever feel, Mance, like everything in previously in your life was done to put you in this situation? Because it feels like with Hedera, you're using all of your powers, from the cybersecurity and all the computer science and everything. Is it kind of strange how this all came together, or is that not the case?
It is kind of surreal in some ways to just sit back and contemplate how far we've come. And in retrospect, we see, an interest in patterns and disciplines that certainly contribute to where we are today that we didn't recognize back then. This theme of decentralization that is so prevalent today, and of course we're right in the middle of. Way back, right after my military days, our first startup, Lehman Baird and I, Lehman Baird is my co-founder. He's the inventor of the technology that we're using today. We did a startup in the space of identity and access management, and we were building a decentralized password management system, as a layman's way of thinking about it, way back then. And so we've always been fascinated by the power and promise of decentralization. Generally, it's been seen in earlier projects and products that we've built. And yes, the work that we're doing today is sort of a culmination of that. In some ways, the market has led us to this. In other ways, we've been outside of the market and discovered our own path. But now it's come to fruition, and the world is changing, and we're now calling it by a name, Web 3.0, as opposed to what it was 25 years ago in Web 1 and then Web 2 and the development of the social media platforms and the tech giants that we see today. And now we're on this cusp of Web 3.0, which is going to change society in some fundamental ways. And we happen to be in the middle of that. So it's very gratifying. I couldn't say that we've charted our path. There was no master plan, but we certainly have been on the right path to be where we are today.
You just dropped these terms Web 2.0 and 3.0, and I think they're really important, and they probably also will take us right into what you're doing with Hedera Hashgraph. But if my mom's watching, she's 78, she's in San Diego. By the way, she's got a MetaMask wallet, thanks to me. She's got some stable coins, so we're getting there. My 17-year-old daughter has that as well. But if you had to explain to her, or when you bump into people on the streets, how do you explain to them this difference between Web 2.0 and 3.0, this kind of evolution from these few companies kind of controlling our information to the future where maybe it's more peer-to-peer or transparent or blockchain? How do you explain it?
Well, there are two parts to that answer. One is, when we think back to the 90s and the emergence of Web 1.0, I remember trying to explain to my parents what the World Wide Web is or was, right? And it was hard. They didn't really appreciate it until they began to use the applications on it. Email comes to mind, right? Once they started using email, then they got a sense for what it was. Now, alongside of Web 1.0, there were these walled gardens that we all remember. Those of us that are old enough remember Prodigy and CompuServe and AOL.
AOL, yeah. Right?
Everyone remembers AOL. And they sort of predate in some ways Web 1.0. And then there are these stories where we saw that the tech giants back then, there's a famous story of Bill Gates. Bill Gates was building out their equivalent of an AOL or a CompuServe, and he agonized over this decision. Do I try to turn the ship and embrace these open standards that are HTML and HTTP, and or do I go the way of AOL? And he made the right decision, right? He turned the ship, and they, in 1995, they added TCP/IP to Windows 95 and introduced Internet Explorer to compete with Netscape.
Yeah.
And Web 1.0 was born. And then Web 2.0, for a lot of different reasons, didn't follow that same path, right? What we see in Web 2.0 is the emergence of these tech giants, these primarily social media platforms that are walled gardens. We've got YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and they didn't adopt the same kind of standards that made interoperability possible across social media. And Web 3.0 is an attempt to try and change that, to reintroduce standards that break down these walled gardens, not just in the social media platforms, but in other platforms as well that came out of Web 1.0. And that's how I tried to explain the differences between Web 1, 2, and 3. I'm sure we'll talk more about Web 3. But that's it. And, you know, when I'm talking to my mom and dad about what is Web 3.0, it's going to end up being taking the same pattern as Web 1.0 did. They'll understand it when they start using the applications that run on top of it. And most of the population today has heard of NFTs. I think everyone's heard of Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is still only held by a relatively small number of people. My parents don't have Bitcoin. They're not experiencing Web 3.0 in that sense. They're not buying NFTs either, but a lot of people are. You know, so the NFTs are sort of the gateway drug, if you will, into an understanding of what Web 3.0 is. That's how I would approach it.
Yeah, that's a great explanation, and I might just go down that thread a little bit. But I remember sending my first email in 1989. It was that at mit.edu, and I sent, it was called the Athena Project Athena at MIT, and I sent an email to my brother who was at Stanford, and then, Mance, I didn't use it for 3-4 years. Like, I didn't use it, but funny enough, my grandma started sending emails a few years later, so because she could sense the utility. Even though she was in her 70s, I get this point, in Phoenix, Arizona. So like you said, people could see that utility from email, but email is a great description. And actually, I had Andreas Antonopoulos here many years ago, and he said, you know, our first experience of the internet was email, and we thought, you know, this is cool, but is that it? And he used to compare Bitcoin to that. You know, we had one thing we could do with it. But when we saw the browser, we said, oh, wow, internet is this. And then when we saw, you know, social media interaction and upload, and we saw, okay, that 2.0, and now we're seeing this incredible kind of peer-to-peer, decentralized, like blockchain version. And I guess in the ideal world going forward is your parents and my parents will use it and maybe not even know they're using it. Maybe that means that
That's exactly right. I mean, what we're building is just infrastructure. It's plumbing, right? It's not meant to be seen. In fact, it's successful if you never think about it. If you have to think about it, then there's still problems. And it's the applications and the benefits that the applications bring to individuals and businesses that will, you know, that's the promise of Web 3.0 and what we're all hoping to achieve. But we shouldn't think about it.
Yeah, that means it's doing its job correctly. I want to jump into the details of Hedera, but you mentioned Bitcoin and NFTs, so I got to ask, will your parents own Bitcoin or an NFT first? And in a couple minutes, what do you make of this NFT explosion? I know it's a big part of the future of Hedera Hashgraph. It's something that I'm watching in real time happen in front of me. I'll say one thing before I let you answer. Mance, when I gave my 17-year-old daughter an NFT, I was the coolest dad in the world for a week. And that's a very difficult thing to do with a teenager. And one other thing, Mance, I could have given her a new car, and I don't think it would have been as cool. So we're unlocking something from humans, emotions, expressions that I don't know if we've ever seen before, but it's real. It is the new gateway drug of the blockchain space. And maybe it's reflecting back to us humans what we really are in a quantifiable way on the blockchain that we've never seen before. I don't know. What do you think is happening with this phenomenon? How are you observing it as it's happening in real time?
Sure. Well, I think NFTs, first off, NFTs are just one part of tokenization. And tokenization is much broader than NFTs. We'll talk about it maybe, pardon me. But specifically with NFTs, what's happening is it's giving creators generally the opportunity to create. Now, most people think about pictures or paintings or whatever that an NFT represents, that sort of thing, and certainly that's part of it. But it's enabling an entire economy to be built up and around these digital assets that are unique and can't be cloned. right? And that's what blockchain generally, and our tech hashgraph specifically also, brings to the market, the opportunity to have something in digital representation that you can't make a copy of and clone or have duplicates of. You can't, quote, double spend the token, because only one of those digital tokens exists, and you can prove that that is the real token and no one else has a copy of it. Now that we've solved that problem, it gives opportunity for creators generally to create and to tokenize their creation and sell that in a marketplace. Now, what's interesting is that the market has woken up to this, but when you start thinking about those tokens and how they might be used more broadly outside of just the space of creators creating artwork or whatever, then you begin to see how it can sort of fundamentally change business workflows and ultimately society as a result. When you think about supply chain use cases and the combination of having raw materials flow into supply chain that get turned into, say, sneakers or some widget generally, and a token associated with that, and interfacing with decentralized finance systems and digital workflows and product insurance and factoring of accounts receivables that are tokenized. When you put all of these pieces together, it fundamentally changes the way finance works within our society. And then it goes beyond that. It's broader than just finance. So this new Web 3.0 that we are just touching on, that has as a major component of itself that being tokens, tokenization, and then NFTs is just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to have profound impacts, and we're in for quite the ride over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think you're right. And again, you've said that everything will be tokenized in the future. I still think it's hard for most people, and it's been hard for me, to visualize that future of everything being tokenized and how it changes everything, because we've never seen it before. And it sounds correct in theory, but I think when it happens, people will really start to understand how the massive efficiencies that come about when, like you said, you can tokenize everything from, like you said, even an accounts receivable perspective, or to be able to quantify and arrange and account for everything. And it opens up an exciting future. And like you said, an NFT right now, in its current iteration, is strangely, a lot of times a JPEG that people clearly value, but people don't know why they value it. But like you said, it's the tip of the iceberg. It's a bit like the email compared to the internet. We're seeing one use case, but it's pretty exciting about what can be tokenized in the future. And I know you want to be a big part of that. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about hashgraph, Hedera, and what I guess is this layer one solution. And I'll probably ask you the question you get from a lot of people, which is, what makes your layer one different than other layer ones? You are clearly in the running. I've been lucky enough to have other conversations with accomplished computer scientists like you, like Dr. Silvio Macali. I've spoken to the guys at AVAX. I spoke with some brilliant people that are out there really maybe doing God's work to a certain extent, because my side job is I teach in my DeFi Academy, and I've got hundreds of students from around the world. And Mance, the biggest complaint is the gas fees. They complain all day, every day about the gas they have to pay, because I get them to use Ethereum chain for all the DeFi protocols because they're learning for the first time. And they're all saying, Brian, when will this stop? And I say, it's going to stop when these layer ones come into fruition, probably, and give us these new options. So based on that, maybe your comments, and tell us a little bit about what Hedera Hashgraph is.
Sure. Well, so I think there are two parts to the equation in being successful as a layer one. One certainly is the technology. You have to have rock solid technology. And Lehman Baird, my co-founder, invented something called hashgraph back in 2015 that really was a fundamental advance in computer science in the field of distributed consensus, that gave us this piece of technology, this consensus algorithm that is the foundational building block for everything, that has fantastic properties in terms of security and performance, fundamentally solving some problems. And then in addition to the tech, maybe equally important, in some cases, maybe more important, is the governance of what is a global piece of infrastructure, a global network. And when we think about adoption and companies and businesses that are making decisions about which piece of infrastructure they're going to build their solution, their application on top of, because they're making a bet, right? When you choose a platform like that and you're getting ready to spend millions of dollars to build out a product, you want to know that you're building on top of a platform that is solid in terms of the technology, but also is going to be well managed, well run, and it's going to last for 100 years. That's been the goal, is to create a piece of infrastructure that's going to be around for generations to come, that the Web 3.0 economy gets built on top of. And so governance is equally important. When it comes to the governance portion of Hedera, we are unique in the industry. I actually read a book back in roughly 2015, 2016 timeframe, written by a gentleman named D. Hock. D. Hock was the founder of the Visa network. He's still with us. I had the great pleasure of speaking with him a couple of years ago, but back in the 60s, he was the founder of Visa, back when it was called Bank Americard, before it was called Visa. And he wrote a book about that experience and about the governance model that they created for creating what we know as Visa today. I marked up the book and I applied it here to our particular context. And what it led us to is a governing body that ultimately will be 39 strong. We have 25 governing council members today. They represent the biggest, largest companies and most prestigious universities in the world. They are intentionally chosen to be cross-industry. So it's not a bunch of banks or a bunch of tech giants or any one single industry. We've intentionally invited members that range the full range of global use cases by industry, if you will. They're also geo-distributed. They represent the entire global market. And finally, they're term limited. They can only stay council members for a maximum of 6 years, 2 3-year terms. And this collection, there are 25 of them today that have been announced. We're growing to 39. They include members like Google and IBM and FIS, WorldPay, and global law firms, DLA Piper and Denton's, banks, Nomura out of Tokyo, and Standard Bank out of South Africa, the largest bank in Africa, and Shinhan out of South Korea, retail and Magazine Luiza out of Brazil. They sort of think of them as Amazon for Brazil, and on and on and on. There are 25 of them. Deutsche Telekom and is another example. And they govern. They govern through committees. There is a technical standards committee, a technical steering committee that manages the roadmap for this global infrastructure. And there's a legal and regulatory committee that manages the regulatory stance and posture and strategy for the organization, and treasury management, and on and on and on. And so there's nothing else like this in the industry. We've, instead of having an advisory board, we said, let's just bring in the customers themselves and let them govern. And that's the other half of the equation. So we've got fantastic tech in hashgraph with performance and security. And then we got fantastic world-class governance in the council. And the two pieces together provide an exceptional value, a set of value points to the market. And I think that's why we're doing so well.
Yeah, this makes you very unique. And again, I've spoken to a good chunk of layer ones. And when I heard the names, the Google, the IBMs, the Boeings, and I was like, wow, not easy to even get those people to talk about blockchain or develop blockchain, let alone to be involved in your governance, and you're smiling because you're probably like, yeah, Brian, it took me 4 years to get that done, right?
Yeah.
And those are big names, and this model based on Visa is really interesting. I'd love to spend a moment there because I don't know, I didn't read that book and I don't know much about Visa, but from what I understand, it was originally, I think, owned by all the banks, I think. Maybe that changed afterwards. And it was built because, and again, Visa always flies under the radar. That story isn't told very often. But it obviously allowed them all to collaborate to streamline payments, and it changed the world. And yet, funny enough, we talked about Web 3.0. It's technology that no one of us ever think about how it works or who owns it. We just use it all the time, right? And it clearly works, and we pay a lot of money for that tech, and it's worked for 50 plus years. So maybe you can comment on that, and then how hard it is to get all of these organizations on board, and they're making a big bet on you, like you said. I mean, to do this, they're making a choice, and the next 100 years, I mean, who was in the S&P 500 100 years ago, and are they still here?
Exactly.
That's a good question.
Well, and that's why we put in the term limits. We do understand that there's an importance, it's important to maintain the sort of the dynamic nature of the organization and having those that represent contemporaneous use cases that are important, right? And having them being the ones that are governing over time. So yes, it was difficult. In fact, we had no idea if we could pull it off. When we were talking to people originally about this, early 2017, most people sort of laughed. Mance, do you know how hard it is to get two global companies, global enterprises to work together, let alone pulling them all together to create a council like what you're describing? So nevertheless, we had a vision, and we thought it was the right way to address the market. And we convinced now 25 of them to buy into that vision and go along for the ride. It's been interesting. In the early days, the earliest council members, we added our first 5 council members in Q1, February of 2019. And with one exception, that being DLA Piper, most of them were there just to observe what was going on in the market. They knew it was important, right? They understood that blockchain was going to be a big deal in the long term, and they had some ideas about how they might use blockchain, but they were there to really learn and understand what was going to happen over time. Today, it's very different. When we add council members today, it's typically the case that we are already working with them on real use cases. And it turns out because of that work, it makes sense that they become part of the council and they get to help govern this infrastructure that they're now going to depend on for their products and services. So the market has changed. It has matured in some very fundamental ways. And the infrastructure has improved, right? What we have today, it's taken years to build. And now we have a piece of technology that is just incredible in terms of what it is capable of achieving. So for example, Bitcoin and Ethereum, those were the first 2 big platforms. Bitcoin sort of stands on its own. Ethereum is addressing a different problem than Bitcoin. Bitcoin sort of is thought of as a store of value or an alternative to gold. A lot of people will like to say Ethereum is trying to make it possible for developers to build decentralized applications on this new infrastructure. Well, those networks can process 7 transactions per second globally and 15, Bitcoin 7 and Ethereum 15 per second, right? Per second, 7 and 15 per second on a global basis. And what we have capacity for today in our layer 1 in the beta version of the product is 10,000 transactions per second in terms of capacity. We're processing on the order of somewhere between 100 and 150 transactions per second now in steady state. So, when you just look at the disparity, it's like the difference between a calculator and a computer. And if you have a computer, then the range of applications that are that can be addressed, that you can solve or address with your technology, of course, is much, much broader than what it is for just a calculator. We knew that going in. That was the vision. We wanted to be able to address mission critical, enterprise grade use cases, and decided to start by inviting those same customers, what would be customers, to the table to be a part of it. And it's working. Today we have a functional council, and we have taken lots of steps to formalize that in various ways, and we're there. We're going to continue adding, but at 25, it's working quite well.
Yeah, and towards the end, I'm going to ask you what it's like to build something with a long-term vision, and what it feels like to be an overnight success, which I'm sure makes you laugh on a regular basis, right? Because you guys were planning this out way back, 7, 8 years ago. And obviously now you're being proven correct, as in this is exactly what the market needs. But maybe towards the end, you can reflect on how it was challenging it was to keep that discipline, maybe which came from the military, to stick to that vision, when the market's telling you a bunch of different things. So I will ask you about that. Besides the governance, Mance, the two other things that popped out in my mind that makes you guys different is obviously your consensus mechanism and algorithm. This, and it's got a great name. Obviously, you're solving the Byzantine generals problem using your gossip about gossip and protocol. Maybe you can tell me about that, which sounds fascinating. And the other thing which I noticed is that you said straight out, this is a distributed ledger, not a blockchain. And that's going to help us take that speed to the next level. And both of those are something I'd love to explore. Let me just say one final comment. I was speaking with, I don't know if we call him one of your competitors, but it was Emin Gunseer from AVAX, another very intelligent computer scientist.
Sure.
It's no surprise that you guys are out leading these layer 1 wars. And he said, look, the elephant in the room is speed. Like, no one's talking about it. It's speed. Without the speed, everything is conversation, as Gordon Gekko used to say. It's just conversation. So from a financial perspective, from a metaverse perspective, and I know you've signed on with Animoca Brands. I've had Yatsu here, incredible, and I've had his co-founder as well, Kenny, on as well. And so, again, nobody wants to wait to know if they get to the next level of the game, right? We need to know now. I worked in Wall Street in the city of London for 15 years. When I'm on the phone closing a deal between Goldman and Morgan Stanley, or Lehman before they went bankrupt, you say done, and you're done, because they need to know if it's done. We used to do that via phone line, and we need that in financial transactions. And I'm glad you emphasized it, because 7 a second, 15 a second might sound fast, but when that's the global traffic, it's not. And guess what? We're feeling it with gas fees and latency. Yeah. So let's maybe talk about those two things. I guess they're probably not separate, but which one should we talk about first? The distributed ledger part of it, or the consensus algo that is going to take you to the next level?
Well, they're kind of the same conversation, right? So when we think about what's required to support a global economy in terms of infrastructure and transactions per second, Visa, last numbers I saw, and these are order of magnitude correct, so don't hold me to the exact numbers, but Visa processes on average about 4,000 transactions per second. And I think that they surge into the 50 or 60,000 range at peak periods. That's a lot, right? That's a lot of transactions per second. And when the transaction occurs, you have to have certainty that it can't be unwound, that it is final. In the technical sense, in the world of finance, it's called finality, right? The transaction has to be final. There can't be any concern that it's going to get unwound in any way. And what hashgraph does, hashgraph is an alternative to blockchain. It is the technology that Lehman invented and we use as the basis for our platform.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.